Hello everyone, welcome to Taiwan Bar. Today we're going to talk about a somehow distant but not so distant neighbor, Southeast Asia. Taiwan is often compared to northeastern countries such as Japan and South Korea, but Taiwan actually has a greater shared history of migration with Southeast Asia. Geographically, we're also closer to Southeast Asia.
So what if we're close?
Aside from our proximity to the region, during the age of exploration that was spearheaded by the VOC, Southeast Asia was the center of Asian trade, the number one in the 17th century. Southeast Asia was unchallengeable, and at the center of the heart was Batavia.
What? Batavia? What's that?
Batavia was the former name of the capital of Indonesia, Jakarta. It was the VOC's business hub in the 17th century and where they began to further expand Asia's thriving trade market. During the VOC's colonial period, Jakarta was dubbed the Queen of the East. How exactly did Batavia become a burgeoning trading hub?
Let's dive in.
In the 15th century, before the Europeans made their way to Asia, Southeast Asia had long been a cultural melting pot and an important transportation hub. They were mainly influenced by the Indian, Chinese, and Islamic culture.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the front of the pack was India. Wow! Dearest viewers, it's highly possible that Indian culture had already made its way into Southeast Asia before the Common Era. Even the early writing systems were deeply influenced by India. A close second would be China. As early as the Han Dynasty, there were already various trade activities. Vietnam was the country most influenced by Chinese Confucianism. Ta-da! The rise of the Islamic civilization was mostly due to the Arabic merchants' introduction of Islam. From then on, more and more Muslim activities and culture were practiced.
Marching on to the 15th century, the Europeans came along. They also found a spot in Southeast Asia. To conduct trade more efficiently, the Europeans occupied various commercial strongholds. Portugal took over Malacca first, then Spain occupied Manila. In the 17th century, the VOC finally made their way to Southeast Asia as well. They rushed to explore the mysterious East in search of the extremely valuable spices. Their first stop was Macau, where they traded with the Ming Dynasty, but Portugal was already there, so there wasn't enough room for both. Then they moved on to Penghu, but was chased away by the Ming Dynasty. The VOC had nowhere to go, but time was ticking and they wanted to make a name for themselves in Asia as well as rake in the cash. In 1619, the VOC ventured to Southeast Asia and occupied what's now Jakarta. They even changed the country's name to the name of an ancient Dutch tribe,
Batavia!
and made it their headquarters in Asia. Even though the VOC's first love was the world's largest producer of pepper, Banten, but according to 17th century international laws, land can be claimed by right of discovery, but this rule only applied to non-sovereign or uncivilized countries. All they needed to do was plant a flag onto the land. But Banten had been under Islamic regime for quite some time. It was impossible to take Banten, so they settled for the second best, Batavia, a barren land where some indigenous people lived. Anyway, the VOC proclaimed,
I choose you, the Pokemon Batavia!
Thus, the VOC gradually built up their enormous trade market in Asia. The VOC had the backing of a powerful force and had dominion over the ocean. And so Batavia became the VOC's trading hub where goods from all over the world were bought and sold. The VOC's earnings skyrocketed, and the city of Batavia flourished. To further increase their profits, the areas outside of the VOC's headquarters in Batavia were plundered and pillaged. First of all, to monopolize trade, the VOC used force to conquer the seas of Southeast Asia. They gained power bit by bit while Portugal's power faltered. As the VOC became a monopoly in Southeast Asia, they took full control of all the spices and other commodities and forced local residents to produce spices, sugarcane, etc. The VOC even enforced a supply chain mandate wherein these agricultural products could only be sold to the VOC at a specified price. There was nothing the villagers could do, even as frustrated as they were. Quite like Taiwan's Japanese colonial period, right? Additionally, the VOC was also heavily involved in slave trafficking. Batavia became notorious for its slave market. Think Costco, but for slaves. Let's just say that moral integrity wasn't a part of the VOC's vocabulary. They took slaves everywhere they went, from the islands of Southeast Asia to China's coastal areas. They also exploited the slaves to rake in the dough. With their ingenious but immoral tactics, the colonized people were miserable. But the VOC stock kept blowing up. They seemed unstoppable. They became so filthy rich. But this prosperity was of no help to Indonesia at all. All it brought was pain and tragedies. Being mistreated by the VOC, the citizens' pent-up anger eventually reached a boiling point. Their acts of rebellion became known as the Java War. Though the VOC suppressed these rebellions several times, but in the long run, these huge military expenses caused a sizable dent in the VOC's finances, which became one of the main reasons for their decline. Hold up, there's one thing I need to clarify. The Chinese were all over Southeast Asia. Today, they control most of the economic activities in the district, but the locals aren't that fond of them. If you turn time back to 300 years ago to the age of exploration, you'd find the European colonizers committed several massacres of the Chinese people. Why were the Chinese so disliked? Huh? The endless tragedies of the Chinese were mostly due to their huge power. The coastal Chinese leaving their homes in search of greener pastures can be traced back to a time long before the Europeans discovered Southeast Asia. The ports in Southeast Asia have long been frequented by millions of Chinese. These Chinese merchants were the major players. Like in Batavia, there were so many Chinese that it looked like Chinatown. Though the existence of Chinese merchants were beneficial to the Voc's business, but too many of them was a threat to the Voc. The Voc took care of the Chinese every now and then to remind them of their place. The history of immigration of the Chinese was sullied by blood and tears. Since ancient times, China's sovereignty and dynasties were built mostly on land. Anyone who left the country, well, the government thought,
Oh, it's you who chose to leave the motherland. Whatever happens to you is none of our concern now.
That's why the rise of Gent Tong was so important. What he built in Taiwan was a Chinese dominant regime that took to the seas, and it was also a maritime hegemony that could rival the West. In 1662, Gent Tong drove the Voc away and took over Taiwan. He then set eyes on an island once ruled by Spain, Luzon, which is the Philippines nowadays. Though it was an island ruled by the Europeans, there were many Chinese merchants in Luzon. Gent Tong believed it was a great opportunity, so he wrote to the Spanish governor demanding their surrender. He threatened to send troops if he needed to. The governor was terrified after reading the letter. No, this can't be true. God help me, it's not an illusion. Everyone knew how powerful Gent Tong's regime was. He was the one who drove the Voc out of Taiwan, a huge threat. But who'd have thunk it? Before Gent Tong could declare war, his own death was declared first. If Gent Tong had lived long enough to sail his troops to Southeast Asia, the power dynamic could be very different, and the situation for Chinese in Southeast Asia could have been rather different too. With all that being said, we finally gained a better understanding about how trade further flourished in Southeast Asia in the 17th century. The Chinese, Indians, and Arabians had been trading in Southeast Asia for over 1,000 years. The arrival of the Voc was a game changer. They were hell-bent on plundering more land, properties, and manpower. Southeast Asia became a part of their global trade market. The same European-style ransacking also played out in America and Africa. History kept repeating itself, like how Japan later built their sugar empire in Taiwan. Or even modern capitalism. It's the same vicious cycle. It's like two characters keep replaying the same script, the mighty usurper and the exploited usurped. We all know how the story goes, but will there ever be a plot twist? After experiencing several global-scale atrocities, we seem to have come to realize that the whole of humanity will always be intertwined. With a better understanding of sustainable development and universal human rights, is it possible for all of us to work hand in hand to fully eradicate this suppression and oppression among different cultures? Can we keep working towards the common good? Alrighty. I'm a little parched after all that talking. Let's down this Iraq, and I'll see you next time. Bersulong.